morning. We're studying a lesson that is entitled Slaves in Egypt. And of course, it's based upon Israel's slavery, as is recorded there in Exodus chapter 1, and some of the events that happened there, how they got there, things of that nature. And despite what English version or translation you might be reading, the Hebrew text actually begins, the very first word in this book is the word "and." And what that indicates to us is this is a continuation of the story of the book of the story that's told in the book of Genesis. Of course, we know that the Old Testament is God's continued story of His great salvation, His plan to save mankind. It was first announced to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 and verse 15. It was later extended on in a promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 verses 1 through 3 as we studied this morning. The theme of the book of Exodus is deliverance. And in order to have a delivery, you have to have a deliverer. And that's kind of where Moses comes into the picture of this great book. He is not only the liberator of Israel, he's also a legislator and a mediator too. He's a lot of things to Israel. And first we read, before we actually get into the deliverer himself, Moses, we read a little bit of history behind the events that are taking place at his birth. And I mentioned this morning, there's 4 key words that I want us to think about this Lord's Day. When it comes to Exodus chapter 1, it kind of serves as a good outline for that chapter 2. Now, we've already looked at 2 of those this morning, so I'm not going to rehash all those. I'll just briefly mention, we talked about the word covenant. We also mentioned very, very briefly in the end of our lesson this morning, the idea of change. And tonight we want to start with the third word, or the third idea, and that is the word conflict. You know, as you read about it, obviously there's a conflict that is developing, at least between the Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, and the descendants of Abraham. And as you look at Exodus chapter 1, beginning in verse 9, now remember in verse 8, we mentioned this morning, the change that came about was really a change in attitude toward the descendants of Abraham. You know, before they had been looked at as very favorably, they've been treated well, but now they are viewed as a threat, and they're going to be treated very harshly because of that. That leads to a birth, or a birth of conflict between, again, the Egyptians and the Israelites. And so in verse 9, we're reading about the words of this new Pharaoh, or new king that has come into power. It says, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses." Now, not only I mentioned the idea this morning that change is something that's inevitable. It's because we live in a physical world. I think it would be fair to say that conflict is also inevitable too. You live long enough in this world and you're going to encounter some type of conflict. Now, conflict can be self-induced. You know, conflict can be created because of something we say or something we do. We may be at fault because of something that we said wrong or something that we did that was not correct. But what we also learn, at least from this particular instance, is sometimes conflict is not due to something that you have said or done, and so conflict is something that is beyond our control. You know, there was nothing that the children of Israel could control as to how Pharaoh felt toward them. You know, it wasn't because of something that they had said. It wasn't because of their outlandish behavior or anything. It was just because they were growing and multiplying. They were just going about their ordinary day life and functioning as normal human beings. But Pharaoh took exception to the exponential growth that the descendants of Abraham were experiencing here. And so in his foolishness, Pharaoh decides he's not happy with this rapid multiplication of the Jewish people, and so he said, we've got to do something smart here. Now, I want to kind of spend just a little bit of time and emphasize to you, it's actually pretty foolish what he did, but He thought we need to deal with these people with intelligence before they become a problem. We need to get on top of things before something springs up here. And so he points out this idea. Well, we've got to take extreme measures. Now, again, I want to emphasize that Pharaoh was, in his mind, he was doing something that was smart. But if you really stop and consider what he was doing, there were several things that several levels on which he wasn't dealing with Israel. He wasn't dealing with Israel on a just level. He didn't say, let's do something just. He wasn't dealing with Israel on a kindness level. He didn't say, let's do something kind. And so his complete idea revolved around, we've got to do something intelligent to keep this rapid multiplication from occurring. And so he brings up an idea or a solution to the problem. Now, he had no regard, obviously, for human life, as we read about the development of his plan to reduce the population of the children of Israel. And you might stop for a moment, you might ask the question, well, why in the world would he deal so harshly with a group of people who really weren't doing anything wrong? They hadn't started to revolt against Egypt. They hadn't developed a bad attitude toward them or anything like that. But they really weren't causing any trouble. And what we learn from that passage that we just read is that Pharaoh viewed them as a security risk. His thought process was this: well, what happens if another nation comes to attack us and we have this great population among us that's not Egyptian, and they decide they're going to join in with the attacking army? We'll surely be defeated. Or what if it's the case that all of a sudden these people decide, we don't want to live in Egypt anymore? We talked about the size of this group of people, 2 to 3 million people suddenly leaving your country, and here you are as Egypt, you're considered a world power. Well, that would greatly increase the risk of attack from other people if they knew that your population had dwindled by 2 to 3 million people. And so Pharaoh was concerned about both of those things. And the solution that he came up with was, we've got to have hard bondage. We've got to work these people to death. The idea of hard bondage for Israel really shouldn't have come as a surprise to them. I don't know if it did or not, but it shouldn't have, because God prophesied, he spoke of this very thing to Abram many, many years ago. In Genesis chapter 15 and verses 12 through 14, we read about a conversation that takes place between Abraham and God. And God says to Abraham in verse 13 of Genesis 15, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. Well, God had told Abraham very plainly that his descendants would go into a strange country, that they would be enslaved, that they would be mistreated, but he also promised that he would set them free at the right time. Later on, when Moses is writing about some of the events that took place here within Egypt in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 20, notice how he describes the land of Egypt for Israel. He says, but the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as ye are this day. Comparing Egypt to an iron furnace. Well, in that day and age, an iron furnace was something that had intense heat. You put that iron and that metal into it, and then you could form or fashion it into the shape that you wanted it to be. Well, that affliction was the iron furnace for God's people. They experienced great conflict there. There was intense suffering that they had to endure, but it was profitable because they came out being formed and fashioned into a mighty nation that God wanted them to be. And so understand that conflict is going to take place among the human race, but some of that conflict is just going to be beyond our control. It's not going to be because of something we said that we did, and we just have to kind of bear with those things. The second thing that I want to point out to you about the idea of conflict is conflict can cause us to crave something better or something higher. And that's exactly what it did for the children of Israel. In verse 12 it says, but the more, we're in Exodus 1, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. Pharaoh came up with this solution. First of all, we're going to work them, and that's going to slow down the growth of this population. And when that didn't work, Pharaoh said, well, this is the solution. I guess the first one would have been, we've got to work them hard. The second one was, we got to work them harder. And so now he says, no easy way out. 7 days a week, these people are going to be working. They're going to be making bricks. They're going to be building cities. They're going to be doing field work. And so very hard labor-intensive things that Pharaoh assigns to these people. But despite Pharaoh's efforts to thwart the growth of this group of people, the Bible says everything that Pharaoh does, they just continue to grow and to multiply. And this frightened Pharaoh, probably enraged him too, but it also frightened him. And what he understands is he keeps on taking more and more steps in order to try to slow down this population, and then almost to the extent that he tries to eradicate it completely. Now it's interesting if you stop and you think what Pharaoh was worried about was these people turning on him. And I guess what he didn't realize in everything that he was doing here is he was driving the Israelites to wish for what he was trying to prevent. He was trying to prevent them from leaving. He was trying to prevent them from turning against them. And here he is, he's just pouring on more and more labor. What did that do for the children of Israel? It made them come to a point where they were ready to leave Egypt. You know, as long as everything was going well in Egypt, they had no reason to want to leave. As long as they were respected, as long as they lived in the land of Goshen, as long as they enjoyed the best that Egypt had to offer, there would have been no desire for them to go. But it's when things turn difficult that we begin to long and to desire for something much better. Peter wrote about it in this way in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 14. Of course, 2 Peter 3 is the idea of the destruction of this earth. But he says in verse 14, "Wherefore, beloved, seeing that ye look for such things, be diligent that ye may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless." The King James Version translates that phrase, "you look for these things." I think the New King James Version translates it, "you look forward to these things." And that's the real idea in the Greek language. It's the idea of anticipation. It's the idea of looking forward to something. Now, why would you be looking forward to the dissolving of the heavens and the melting of the earth? Because that's the context in which Peter is writing here. And the answer is simply because of the turmoil that exists here in this life. You know, the Bible also, Paul himself talked about this very idea in Philippians 1 and verses 22 and 23. And he said, "I live in the flesh, and this is the fruit of my labor, yet what I shall choose I wot not, for I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better." Long years of ease and comfort and luxury had made Israel want to stay in Egypt. But now all of a sudden things have changed. Now there is turmoil. Now there is conflict. Now there is oppression. And so it's developing within them a desire to get out of Egypt. And that's exactly what's going to happen a little later on in the book. Now, we understand that life's conflicts gives us perspective that no other will. You know, as long as we're happy and comfortable in this world, we're not going to have that strong desire to depart out of it, are we? We're not going to have a strong desire for something that is better. We're not going to long for heaven like the Bible speaks of. I think that's why when Peter and a lot of the first century authors wrote where Christians were being oppressed, they were looking forward to heaven. They were looking forward to something better than this world had to offer. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. If everything went perfectly for us in this life, why would we ever want to leave? Why would we ever long for something better? It's the difficulties of this life that make us long for heaven. It's the tragedies that we experience. It's the trials and the uncertainties of this world that make us long for something higher. Don't misunderstand me. I'm grateful for the time that God has given us here upon this earth. I'm thankful for the blessings that we enjoy. But friends, I don't want to live in this world forever. I know that there's a better world that is waiting, and I look for that better world, and I long for it, and I look forward to the day that all of us will get to experience that better life. Well, again, think about the effect that it had upon the children of Israel. Conflicts can cause us to crave something better, to desire something and long for something better. And that's what Israel wanted. They wanted freedom. They wanted out of these oppressions. The last word that I'll mention to think about in this chapter, and again kind of outlines it for us, verses 15 through 22, the end of the chapter, is the word commitment. And we learn a lot about the idea of being committed here in this particular chapter. One of the things that I want to point out to you, the first thing is that we learn is we're going to have to make the commands of God our central priority or focus. If we want to be committed to God, we have to put His commands in the forefront of our minds and our hearts and in our lives. And notice in verse 15, the king of Egypt spake unto the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. Again, Pharaoh is growing increasingly frustrated with his efforts to try to slow down the growth of the descendants of Abraham. He's come up with this idea of working them hard. That didn't work, so he came up with the idea of working them harder. Everything that he's doing, they continue to grow and to multiply. And so now he's to the point where he says, we've got to do something drastic here. And so he calls upon the midwives to carry out this plan. He said, you guys are going to be helping delivering these babies. And so if it's a male baby, I want you to kill that baby. Now think about that command. Think about how harsh and how cruel and how unsensitive you would have to be, first of all, to do that, but secondly, to command somebody else to do it in your stead. Well, think about what would have happened if that plan had succeeded. What would have happened? Well, all the Jewish males would have been wiped out for that generation. You would have had all these females. They wouldn't have had any males to marry, and so they would have had to intermarry with the Egyptians. And what that would have done is that would have made them more committed to that nation. It would have basically integrated them into the nation of Egypt itself. Well, God would not permit such a thing to happen. And so he raises up these two midwives who he knows are going to be committed to him. They're going to put his command as their central priority. You know, this is the first instance, if I'm not mistaken, in Scripture of what we call civil disobedience. There's a number of examples of it throughout the Bible. We know what the Bible teaches us about the commands of men and about those who are in power and authority when it comes to the physical world. Peter wrote about it in 1 Peter 2 and verses 13 through 15. And he says there for us to submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be as to the king as supreme, or unto governors, or unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Peter covers a number of categories here. First of all, he talks about whether you submit to the ordinance of a man, whether we're talking about the supreme ruler. Well, in our instance, that would be the President of the United States. He said whether it be as to governors, that may be those who are other than. Well, every state in the United States has a governor, and so he would rank underneath them. But then he goes on to say this, even those who are put in positions of authority to punish evildoers, submit to them. Well, that would be law enforcement, right? So you have all these different areas of power and authority within human government. And the message of the Bible is very clear. Obey the laws of the land. Submit to those who rule over you. Well, there is one exception. And that exception is we cannot submit to an ordinance of man that violates the law of God. The commands of God are our central focus and central priority. And if we're going to be committed to God, then they have to remain central within our minds. You read about the apostles in Acts chapter 5, verses 27 through 29. The Sanhedrin Council brings them in, and they're standing before them, and they say, didn't we straightly command you, or didn't we obviously command you not to speak or to preach or teach in the name of Jesus Christ? And here you guys are out here and you're filling Jerusalem with this doctrine. Remember the statement of Peter and the apostles when they said we ought to obey God rather than men. That attitude is exemplified in these midwives. Pharaoh told them, when these male babies are born, you kill them. They said, we're not going to do it. And the reason that they didn't do it, the Bible says, is because they feared God. God's commandments were their focus and their central priority. The second thing that I want to point out to you that we learn about commitment is we have to continue to be committed even through difficult times. In verse 18 it says, And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have you done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. Well, thank God that these Hebrew midwives were committed to the commandments of God. I shudder to think what would have happened had they not been. There's been a lot of discussion. Pharaoh calls them in and they're standing before him and he says, Hey, what's going on here? I told you guys you're supposed to kill all these male babies and they're all surviving. Well, notice what they said. Well, they said, not our fault. These Hebrew women, they aren't like the Egyptian women. I imagine a lot of the Egyptian women, now remember, this was a nation that was at the top at this particular point in time, enjoyed some of the finest luxuries that day and age had to offer. And I don't mean anything condescending toward women, but I think they were pretty soft, those Egyptian women. They weren't like the Hebrew women. Those were workers. They went out there, they labored 7 days a week. They were tough cookies, as we would say. And so they delivered. Their excuse was, listen, they're not over here crying and carrying this process out. They're popping these children out right and left. They're tough. They're ready for this. They've set themselves up for it. The question becomes this: were they lying? Were they lying? Well, I doubt it. I think that probably would have been the case given the environment. But I also believe this. I believe that those midwives said, don't call us until after the baby is born. Don't tell us to come until things have already happened, because we're under obligation here and we're going to be held accountable for that. God blessed them because they put their lives on the line for these children. And it's kind of interesting to me, in verse 20, we read that God dwelt well with the midwives, and here's how he dwelt well. In verse 21, God made them houses. Now, he wasn't talking about physical structures. He was talking about family. And think about, this was the blessing that God gave them. God blessed them with many children. Now, I don't know if they had an agreement with Pharaoh where since they were the midwives, if they got to keep the male children, I don't know if that would have been a blessing or a curse. Or maybe God set them up where they just had daughters. I don't know. But children are a blessing from God. And that was God's blessing, his reward for them, doing what he told, or keeping his commandments central and priority in the things they were doing. What is the answer for us in times of devastation, in times of defeat and conflict? The answer is stay committed to God. Pharaoh changed his plan now from just these Hebrew midwives carrying out the execution of these Jewish male babies to the entire Egyptian. So now he broadens his command to all Egyptians everywhere. Whoever sees a Jewish male being born, to take that baby and to throw it in the river. I want to think, as we're ending here tonight, I want you to stop and to think what was the thought process and the feelings and the emotions that were taking place within the mind of these Israelites. Well, I imagine it was bad enough to have to work 7 days a week. It was bad enough that this working was hard labor and cruel treatment. But now they're killing your children too. The time for Israel to leave had come. I think they had enough at this particular point. They needed to deliver. And God was going to raise up one Jewish male baby that no one could kill no matter how hard they tried. Moses, their deliverer, was coming. Maybe there's one present in our audience